The silhouette against the sunset is one of the most reproduced images in Western cinema. You've seen it 100 times, reprinted in books, frozen on posters, referenced in films made decades later. A lone rider moving toward the horizon, the dying sun turning him into pure shadow, the kind of ending that feels like poetry. But wait, because the man in that silhouette isn't Gary Cooper, and the tears running down his face inside that darkness, tears the camera couldn't see, tears nobody knew about until 40 years later, belonged to someone who hadn't been on a horse in 30 years. This is the story of how that ride happened and why it almost didn't. September 1958, somewhere in the high desert of New Mexico, the production was called The Lonesome Trail, a late-career Western for Gary Cooper, the kind of picture that existed because his name still meant something at the box office, even if the scripts weren't what they used to be. Cooper was 57 years old, thinner than he'd been a decade ago, moving a little slower, but he still looked right on a horse, still carried that quality of quiet authority that had made him famous, and the studio was betting that audiences would pay to see him one more time before the sun set on his kind of picture. The horse wrangler's name was Thomas Redfeather, 63 years old, Shoshone on his mother's side, Welsh on his father's. He'd been working Hollywood productions for 18 years, managing the horses that stars pretended to ride, training the animals for the specific movements that cameras required, keeping the four-legged performers calm amid the chaos of lights and crew and noise. He was good at his job, quiet, reliable. The kind of man who showed up early, did his work, and left without expecting anyone to notice. The wranglers who worked under him respected him. The actors he served barely knew his name. That was fine with Thomas. He'd had enough of being known. Notice what the other wranglers said about him when anyone bothered to ask, because the details paint the picture. He never rode. In 18 years of working with horses, nobody had ever seen Thomas Redfeather in a saddle. He led them, groomed them, trained them from the ground. He could calm a spooked stallion with his voice alone, could read a horse's mood from 50 feet away. But riding? Never. The younger wranglers assumed it was age, bad knees maybe, a back that couldn't take the impact anymore. They didn't ask, and he didn't explain. That was the understanding. The truth was different. The truth was 30 years old, buried so deep that Thomas had almost convinced himself it belonged to someone else, a different man, a different life, a story that ended in a rodeo arena in Cheyenne in 1928, when a horse named Blackjack rolled on top of him and 3 vertebrae shattered like dry wood. Thomas Redfeather, though he'd gone by Tommy Red back then, when the name was painted on posters and shouted by crowds, had been the All-Around Cowboy champion of Wyoming 3 years running, bull riding, bronc busting, roping, barrel racing. He could do it all, and he did it better than anyone else in 3 states. The newspapers called him the Shoshone Centaur. The rodeo circuit called him unbeatable, until Blackjack. The doctors told him he was lucky to walk. Riding was out of the question. The spine couldn't take the stress, the impact, the constant adjustments that staying mounted required. One bad fall, and he'd be paralyzed or dead. So Tommy Red became Thomas Redfeather, and the man who'd been famous for what he could do on a horse spent the next 30 years caring for horses he could never ride again. Listen to what Gary Cooper saw on the evening of September 14th, 1958, because this is where the story turns. The production had been shooting for 3 weeks. Standard schedule, standard problems, weather delays, equipment issues, a supporting actor who kept forgetting his lines. Cooper had been professional throughout, hitting his marks, conserving his energy, doing the job he'd been doing for 35 years. He'd noticed Thomas early on. Hard not to. The man had a presence that didn't match his position. The way he moved around the horses, the way they responded to him. suggested a relationship that went deeper than employment. Cooper had worked with a lot of wranglers over the years. This one was different. On the evening of September 14th, the stunt team was rehearsing a chase sequence for the following day's shoot. Nothing complicated. 3 riders pursuing a 4th through a canyon, standard Western business. The riders were young, athletic, comfortable in the saddle the way professionals are comfortable. Thomas was standing at the edge of the corral, watching. Cooper had finished his scenes for the day and was heading back to his trailer when he noticed the wrangler's face. Not watching the rehearsal the way a supervisor watches, checking form, noting problems. Watching it the way a man watches something he's lost, something he can't have back. The expression wasn't envy, wasn't bitterness. It was something Cooper recognized from a different context entirely. The face of an actor watching a scene he knows he'll never play, a role that passed him by, a version of himself that exists only in memory. Grief, that was the word. Thomas Redfeather was grieving. Cooper changed direction, walked toward the corral instead of his trailer, stood beside Thomas for a long moment without speaking, both of them watching the young riders move through their choreography. "They're good," Cooper said finally. "They are." Thomas's voice was neutral. "Young, strong, they've got time to get better." "You sound like you know something about it." Thomas didn't respond immediately. His eyes tracked one of the riders through a turn, noting the posture, the balance, the small adjustments that separated competent from exceptional. "I used to," he said. "Long time ago." Cooper waited. He'd learned decades ago that the best way to get someone to talk was to give them space to fill. "I was a rodeo rider, championship circuit, 20s and early 30s, had a fall in 28. Doctors said I was done." Thomas's voice was flat, reciting facts that had lost their ability to wound through sheer repetition. "So I found other work. Still horses, still what I know. Just different." "You haven't ridden since?" "Can't ride, spine won't take it. One bad landing and I'm done for good." Cooper looked at him. Really looked. The way he looked at actors he was trying to understand. "But you want to?" It wasn't a question. Thomas was quiet for a long time. The rehearsal was wrapping up. The riders walking their horses toward the stable, the sun dropping toward the mountains in the west. "Every day," he said finally, "every single day for 30 years, I wake up wanting to ride, and every single day I remember why I can't. Remember that conversation, because what Cooper did with it would take 2 weeks to arrange and 60 seconds to execute. The final scene of the Lonesome Trail was the standard Western ending, the hero riding into the sunset, leaving behind the town he'd saved, the woman who loved him, the life he couldn't have. It was the kind of shot that had ended 100 pictures, so familiar it had become almost invisible. The studio wanted a stunt double. Cooper was 57, the light would be tricky, and frankly, at that distance, any competent rider in the right costume would look the same in silhouette. Why risk the star on a shot that didn't require him? Cooper refused. "I'll do my own riding," he told the director, a journeyman named Harold Webb who'd been making westerns since the silent era. "I always have." "Coop, be reasonable. It's 100 yards at sunset. Nobody's going to see your face. Nobody's going to know. I'll handle the riding. Just make sure the camera's in position." Webb didn't argue. Further, when Gary Cooper said he'd handle something, you let him handle it. But Cooper wasn't planning to handle it himself. Here's what he did during the 2 weeks between that conversation and the final day of shooting, because the preparation matters. He found out everything about Thomas Redfeather, not through official channels, through the quiet network of crew members who knew things, through conversations with other wranglers who'd worked with Thomas for years, through old-timers who remembered the name Tommy Red from the rodeo programs of their youth. He learned about the 3 Wyoming championships, about Blackjack, about the doctors who'd told a 26-year-old man that the thing he did better than anyone would now kill him if he tried it again. He learned that Thomas had a daughter in Cheyenne and grandchildren he saw twice a year, that he'd never married again after his wife passed in 1951, that he lived in a small apartment in Burbank and spent his weekends alone watching rodeo broadcasts on television with the sound turned off. And he learned one more thing from a wrangler who'd worked with Thomas for 12 years, who'd seen him on bad days when the grief was closer to the surface. "He keeps a saddle in his apartment," the wrangler said. "Old thing, worn smooth. He oils it every week like he's going to use it. Never does. Just takes care of it." Cooper absorbed all of it, and then he started planning. 3 days before the final shot was scheduled, Cooper asked Thomas to walk him through the sunset ride. "I want to make sure the horse knows the route. No surprises when the cameras are rolling." They walked the path together, 100 yards of open ground ending at a ridgeline that would frame the rider against the dying sun. Thomas explained where the footing was uneven, where the horse might want to drift, what commands would keep the animal moving straight. Cooper listened carefully, asked questions, made Thomas demonstrate the hand, positions, the weight shifts, the subtle cues that would sell the shot. "You make it look easy," Cooper said. "I'm not the one who has to do it." "What if you were?" Thomas stopped walking, looked at Cooper with an expression that mixed confusion and something that might have been fear. "What are you talking about?" "The shot is a silhouette. Face isn't visible. Could be anyone in that saddle." Cooper's voice was casual, but his eyes were watching Thomas carefully. "Could be me. Could be a stunt double. Could be you. I can't ride. I told you. You told me your spine can't take a bad landing. This isn't bull riding, Thomas. It's walking a horse 100 yards in a straight line. Smooth ground, calm animal, no jumps, no turns, nothing that would stress your back. The studio would never. The studio wants a stunt double anyway. They don't care who's in the saddle as long as the shot looks right." Cooper paused. "I'm asking if you want to be the one in that saddle." The silence stretched between them. The desert wind pushed dust across the ground they'd been walking. In the distance, the crew was breaking down equipment from the day's shoot, their voices carrying faintly across the empty space. 30 years, Thomas said finally. His voice had changed, rougher, closer to breaking. 30 years since I've been on a horse. Then maybe it's time. What if something goes wrong? What if I fall? Then we do another take and nobody knows the difference. The camera's 200 feet away. All they'll see is a silhouette. All they'll know is the shot worked or it didn't. Thomas looked at the ridgeline, at the path they'd walked, at the mountains where the sun would set in 3 days, framing whoever was brave enough to ride toward it. "Why?" The word came out cracked, barely audible. "Why would you do this for me?" Cooper was quiet for a moment. "Because I've spent my whole career pretending to be something I'm not. Cowboys, soldiers, sheriffs, I've played them all, and none of them were real. They were performances." He looked at Thomas. "You were the real thing, and you've spent 30 years watching other people do what you used to do better than anyone. That's not right. That's not how it should end." "It doesn't end any different because of one ride." "Maybe not, but you'll know you did it. You'll know that after 30 years, you got back on a horse one more time, and that's something. That's not nothing." Listen to what happened on September 28, 1958, because this is the moment everything came together. The final shot was scheduled for golden hour, the 40-minute window when the sun hung low enough to create the silhouette effect, but high enough to provide usable light. The crew had been setting up since noon, positioning the camera, checking sight lines, making sure nothing would interrupt the shot once it started. Cooper had arranged everything quietly. He'd told Webb that he'd changed his mind about the stunt double, that someone else would take the ride, that it was handled. Webb didn't ask questions. By that point in production, he'd learned that Cooper's handled meant handled. Thomas arrived at the location 3 hours early. Cooper met him at the corral, away from the main crew, and helped him mount for the first time in 3 decades. "Take it slow," Cooper said. "Walk him around the corral first. Let your body remember." Thomas's hands were shaking when he took the reins. His legs, when they settled into the stirrups, felt like they belonged to someone else. Muscles memory from a life he'd left behind, responding to commands he'd never thought he'd give again. The horse, a chestnut mare named Bella, chosen specifically for her calm temperament, stood perfectly still as Thomas adjusted his weight, found his center, felt the animal's breathing beneath him, the warmth of her body, the aliveness that he'd missed every single day for 30 years. "Okay," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Okay, I'm ready." He walked Bella around the corral, slow at first, then with increasing confidence. His spine protested mildly. The doctors hadn't been wrong about the stress, but it held. It held. "How does it feel?" Cooper asked. Thomas didn't answer, couldn't answer. The tears were already starting, and he didn't trust his voice. When golden hour arrived, Thomas was in position at the starting mark, dressed in Cooper's costume, the hat, the duster, the silhouette that audiences would assume belonged to the star. The camera was 200 feet away, far enough that facial features were invisible, close enough that the image would be sharp. Webb called for quiet. The sun was dropping fast, painting the sky in oranges and purples, turning the mountains into jagged shadows against the light. "Action!" Thomas touched his heels to Bella's flanks. The mare stepped forward, beginning the walk toward the ridgeline, toward the sunset, toward the ending of a story that wasn't about the character Gary Cooper had played, but about something much older and much more real. 30 years of watching, 30 years of wanting, 30 years of waking up every morning and remembering why he couldn't have the one thing that had made him who he was. And now, for 60 seconds, he had it back. The tears came freely. He didn't try to stop them. The camera couldn't see his face, couldn't see the expression of a man who'd been given back a piece of himself he'd thought was gone forever. All it captured was the silhouette, the rider, the sunset, the image that would become iconic. "Cut!" Webb's voice carried across the desert. "Beautiful, we got it." Thomas stopped Bella at the ridgeline, sat there for a long moment, looking at the sun as it dropped below the mountains, feeling the horse breathe beneath him, letting the moment last as long as it could. Behind him, 200 feet away, Gary Cooper was watching. He didn't applaud, didn't call attention to what had just happened, just stood there with his hands in his pockets, a small smile on his face, watching a man who'd waited 30 years finally get his ride. The footage made it into the final cut. It's still there at the end of the lonesome trail, a film that's otherwise forgotten, a footnote in Cooper's career, the kind of late-period Western that critics dismiss and audiences have mostly stopped watching. But that final shot endures. It's been reproduced in books about Western cinema, referenced by directors who grew up watching it, cited as an example of visual poetry, of how to end a picture with an image instead of words. Nobody who writes about it knows who's actually in the frame. Thomas Redfeather is listed nowhere in the credits. He didn't want to be. When Cooper offered to have his name added, stunt rider or additional horseman or whatever title would fit, Thomas refused. "That's not what it was about," he said. "It was about the ride. The ride was enough." He went back to work the next day, finished out the production, returned to Los Angeles when shooting wrapped, and continued managing horses for another 6 years, until his back finally gave out entirely and he had to retire. But something had changed. The other wranglers noticed it, a lightness that hadn't been there before, a willingness to talk about the old days that he'd never shown. He started telling stories about the rodeo circuit, about Blackjack, about what it had felt like to be Tommy Red in a time that seemed impossibly distant. The grief wasn't gone. It never would be, but it had been answered somehow, completed. He'd gotten his ride, and that had changed something fundamental about how he carried the loss. Here's the detail that matters most, because endings reveal what beginnings only promise. When Thomas Redfeather died in 1971, his daughter found 3 things in his apartment that she hadn't known existed. The first was the saddle, the one he'd oiled every week for 40 years, worn smooth by hands that couldn't stop caring for it. The second was a photograph, a still frame from the lonesome trail showing a silhouette against a sunset. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, "For Tommy Red, who showed me what real riding looks like. Gary Cooper, 1958. The third was a letter, never sent, addressed to no one in particular. 3 sentences written in her father's careful hand. "I got to ride one more time. I didn't think it would matter after so long. It mattered more than anything." The photograph hangs now in a small house in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where Thomas's grandchildren grew up hearing the story their mother told them, about a grandfather who'd been a rodeo champion, about a fall that took everything away, about a movie star who gave one piece of it back. They watch The Lonesome Trail sometimes when it shows up on late-night television. They wait for the final shot, the one everyone thinks is Gary Cooper riding toward the sunset, and they know something that the rest of the audience doesn't. That's their grandfather in that silhouette. That's Tommy Red, riding one last time. That's a man who waited 30 years for 60 seconds and found out that 60 seconds was enough. Some gifts can be seen, some can be measured, and some exist only in the space between what the camera captures and what it misses. The tears inside a silhouette, the story behind an image, the ride that mattered more than anyone watching could possibly know. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. This is a dramatized story inspired by real people and events. Specific dialogue, scenes, and side characters are creative reconstruction for storytelling purposes.